Thanks very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Hutchings. I'm Dean of the LBJ School, and it's wonderful to welcome you all here on Veterans Day. Could we start by asking all those who serve in the military today or who are veterans to stand and be recognized? Well, thanks very much. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce this panel and then be a panelist because I'm a Naval Academy graduate myself and the son of a Naval Academy graduate and the nephew of a Naval Academy graduate. Both of them served entire military careers. My dad and my uncle both retired as rear admirals. That's 2 stars. The gentleman to my left had 4 stars, but I can say my dad and my uncle together had 4 stars. And so the Naval Academy is the Naval Academy is the service academy that wins Army-Navy football games. Okay. This is an important topic, and it's important that we gather here to reflect on some issues concerning our veterans. I'm of the Vietnam era. It was an era when everybody knew somebody, a family member in the military. I mean, there was hardly a person in the United States that didn't have a family member or a close friend or both serving in Vietnam. Now, it was an era in which the military became vilified, wrongly, I think. They became vilified for political decisions that they were simply implementing. But at least it was an era that people actually knew what was going on. They knew what was going on in the jungles of Vietnam. When people came back, they came back maybe to political hostility, but to a population that understood the world they'd been living in. We now live in an era, mercifully, in which our military is recognized for valor and service and honored upon return. But it's also an era in which very few people have direct experience in the military. Very few people in the United States, as a percentage, have any family member or even a close friend who served in Iraq or Afghanistan. So our veterans return home to a friendly country that it thanks them for their service, but which really doesn't understand the worlds in which they've been living, the very different worlds in which they've been living. So that's not very healthy either. We'd like to get to a point of view where the military is both understood and honored for their service. I think the honoring of our service, I'm going to say something that may surprise you. I think this has gone maybe a little too far because I think at heart there's a kind of a guilt trip that is going on here, that so many of our elected officials didn't serve, didn't want to serve, don't want their children to serve, and they compensate by glorifying the military. I don't think that's actually healthy for a democracy. I think we need to have a good and balanced view of our military going forward. Otherwise, we're going to set ourselves up for a backlash down the road. So I'm hoping I'm sure this panel will begin shedding some light on a few of the issues that affect our military today. There's some distance to come on both sides. When I was at the Naval Academy, I don't really know whether this is still true, but we were taught as a matter of pride to consider ourselves sort of a breed apart, maybe even a breed better because we'd elected to serve. I don't think that's a very good message. And I think the service academies are doing better now to consider themselves part of a larger society, that they are not superior to other members of society just because they chose to serve, but they consider themselves very much integrated into it. And on the university side, I think we have some work to do to better integrate the understanding of military affairs into our curriculum. In my experience, it's easy to populate a course on post-conflict reconstruction, but much harder to populate one with students on warfare. It's certainly more fun to talk about peace than war, but it's an obligation of citizens in a society to understand war as well. I was struck a few years ago when Bob Gates was Secretary of Defense. He gave an otherwise very inspiring speech in which he said the wars of the future will be primarily political in nature. I thought this is Secretary of Defense that didn't read Clausewitz. Wars have always been political in nature. I'm actually assigning Clausewitz in my class on Wednesday, so I was thinking about that in particular, that wars always have a political objective. War being the continuation of politics by other means, which is really meant to be a positive statement that we don't send our troops into battle just for glory or conquest. They have a political mission in mind. So I think we need to do more at the university and especially at public policy schools to integrate an understanding of military affairs into our curriculum and really into our culture. It's really great that we are home to Army Fellows every year. They've added a great dimension to our presence. They sit in our classes. They're part of our student body. They begin to bring military perspectives into the classroom. And increasingly, we have returning veterans who are now getting back to school and also in the classroom. So maybe we're at a point where we're better connecting the civil side of our society to the military side of our society. Just a final observation that we may now be at a point where the revelations or accusations or allegations concerning NSA surveillance may be stimulating a long overdue public debate about what's permissible now that we're 20 years after the Cold War and well more than a decade after 9/11. It's a conversation that we need to have as a society about what are the limits of what we think is the reasonable way for our country to conduct itself in world affairs, and not simply to inherit past practices as necessarily relevant to the present. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to our friend and colleague Mike Davis to introduce the panel and then moderate a conversation among us. Mike, for those of you who don't know, is Executive Director or CEO of Volunteers of America. He previously served as Volunteers of America, Texas, based in Dallas-Fort Worth. He has previously held executive positions with United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, the Volunteer Center of Dallas, Child Care Group, and Volunteer, the National Center. He holds a BA degree from Texas Christian and a master's in civic affairs from the University of Dallas. He's also a minister with the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. He is, among other things, the recipient of the President's Outstanding Volunteer Action Award, given to very few people. Mike, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. And, this is a great day. Thanks to all of you for coming to this. We realize you didn't have to come. There's no grade given for this, and there's no specific credit. You came because you had a specific interest in veterans and in honoring veterans and in being more acquainted with veterans issues. And so thank you very much for that. That's important to us. It's important to the other organization that I work with in addition to my moonlighting here at the university at Volunteers of America. We have been working for veterans literally since the Civil War, one of the first organizations to be providing services to veterans. We would not be able to do this session here today were it not for the fact that you have here the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Services that is directed by Dr. Sarah Jane Renborg. And wave your hand, Sarah Jane. Thank you for allowing us to do this, and always the folks behind the scenes. Bailey Moon, where are you back there? You're up there somewhere. There she is. The rumor that she's changing her middle name to is not true, but Bailey Moon did some terrific work for us promoting this. I'm sorry, Bailey Cooled, rather, not Bailey Moon. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it for all the promotion and work behind the scenes for this, and also for David Birch from the Volunteers of America communication staff sitting right there, did likewise for this. We're going to have a discussion today that's going to start with the panel giving opening comments and remarks around how they've experienced this issue. And so literally, everything is fair game. Following that, I'm going to ask the individual panelists some questions and ask each of them to respond, and then we're going to turn it over to you and it's going to be your turn. We ask that you sort of hold on and wait for the folks to get there with the microphone, and this is also being live streamed, and so that'll help for the folks who are watching it over the live stream to hear your question, and we're going to go from there. So first of all, we're going to start with Admiral Inman, who has had an incredible background in addition to years of distinguished service as an admiral in the Navy, also being head of the National Security Agency, as you just described, and the deputy director of the CIA, and holding the most distinguished chairmanship here at the LBJ School. So I was thrilled when we were able to get on his calendar and have this opportunity. And so first, thanks to both of you, Dean Hutchings and Admiral Inman, for your service to the country first, and thank you for being here, and the time is yours now.
Age has some advantages, and in this case, it lets me look back at an earlier war. Two earlier wars. I began my college studies with the veterans coming back from World War II. And I was pretty young. They made me their mascot, which was a lot better than being a freak 3 years younger in high school. But I listened to their stories. I saw how they reacted, saw their aspirations, saw what the country did. The GI Bill that enabled large numbers of them go to college who never aspired before, and saw housing programs, the potential for being able to actually own a home, things. My own service began with Korea, and I think it's best described probably as the forgotten war, where all of us were impacted by rationing, all the other things in World War II. The society was marginally impacted by Korea. A lot of casualties, a lot of POWs who were maltreated. More neglect than hostility. I spent 4.5 years in and around the Vietnam conflict, and was never under fire myself, except cities being shelled when I was visiting in Da Nang, Saigon. But in both conflicts, I lost shipmates, good friends, process. So it brings it home personally to you. I'm going over my 2 minutes.
No, you have 1 2 minutes. Don't worry about that.
And
We're not going to worry about time.
I saw the hostility. Okay. But most of all, I saw how divisive the draft was on society. Those who avoided it, those who left the country to avoid it, charges that people were able to manipulate depending on their wealth at all, whether they actually served. But it was a very divisive feature in the society at large. Lots of casualties. Flash forward to watching from a distance Afghanistan and Iraq. The toll on those reserved is still being counted up, processed. There appear to be long-term health problems from having served in the deserts, heat for a long period of time. We had Agent Orange in Vietnam. There are all kinds of things that come up both out of the Gulf War and now out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think the thing that strikes me most, over more than half of our casualties in Iraq were for improvised explosive devices, mostly provided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. But it's the advent of that vast explosion, the loss of life, loss of limbs for those who survive. So that's one specter of it. The other, people who would have died from their wounds, certainly in Korea, probably in Vietnam, survived the great advances, and not only the immediate care, but helicopter lift, evacuation to hospitals. But what that means is we have a much larger percentage of the veterans who have severe injuries. Some physical, others that are mental. But the public's reacted very differently, and I would simply capture Marines coming back from Helmand province, landed in Chicago last week, and they were greeted with applause by the other people in the terminal. And 7 first-class passengers gave up their seats. Now, there may have been some guilt there, Bob, that they're not part of it. I'll accept. But there is an attitude of respect. And we'll come to some of that in the questions as we get to it. And the last one, I have to tease my colleague just a little bit. He spent 4 years being groomed to be an officer. I only had 16 weeks. Well, what they did in that 16 weeks was to pound on us special trust and confidence. And that special trust and confidence was being placed in you, and therefore you were held to a higher standard in your personal conduct. I don't know whether that's been totally forgotten or not, but when I look at my parents' service and see 2 vice admirals currently suspended, one for gambling with chips and the other one alleged to have taken gifts from a larcenous purveyor of services in the Far East, the rest of it, this to me is just shocking, that element of special trust and confidence that was so important in persuading me to do a career. Now maybe it's slipping away. It's no longer that important in the society.
Thank you. Our next panelist is someone, frankly, that I know well. His name is Dr. John Sharon. He is the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of Military Affairs for Volunteers of America. And he came to us literally straight from the VA, having spent a distinguished career there, overseeing their mental health issues and being truly their expert internally over reintegration for those folks returning from service. At the same time, I told him when we hired him that if any organization needed a staff psychiatrist, it was Volunteers of America. And so John immediately became our staff psychiatrist. But he is one of the recognized experts around the country and spends his time traveling the country to enable our affiliates to enhance and increase their services to veterans, and specifically with the clinical approach towards PTSD. So Dr. Sherin.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, the organization does require some assistance from time to time. This is a really, really special day, Veterans Day. And I was telling Mike when I saw him today that I on Thursday, I addressed about 600 teenagers at this local school in Los Angeles, and they had a certain level of energy and interest that it really kind of blew me away. Because the fact of the matter is, we've got Independence Day, July 4th, and every year we have a Veterans Day, and it's these folks who continue to defend our country and our way of life. And we as a country need to recognize this day as one of the most important days in our calendar. To piggyback on some of the comments of Dean Hutchings and Admiral Inman, I went to school for a very long period of time, I don't have any family members directly that are involved in this conflict, and I don't, until I joined the Volunteers of America. When I was working in the VA, I knew veterans as guys and gals that were coming to the VA to get help. Since joining Volunteers of America, I've had the absolute honor and pleasure of spending much more time with a different subpopulation. I don't want to go through them by names necessarily, but a handful of the absolute smartest, most motivated, capable people that I've met in my entire career. And it's one of the things that at the Volunteers of America we recognize is that veterans are civic assets and leaders in our country. And they need to be seen that way, understood that way, and leveraged that way in our society. I have three real principles that I just wanted to mention briefly. And the first is we have a moral obligation, an ethical obligation as a country to look after the folks who are defending our country, our way of life. We have a fiscal responsibility to do it as well, not just because of the cost of taking care of those who return and have needs, but also, as I was alluding to, by leveraging these individuals to uplift our country. And lastly, to paraphrase George Washington, who many, many years ago told us that the willingness of our citizens to defend our country will depend directly upon how those who have gone before them are treated when they return. So at some level, this is a national security issue. And I just leave you with those three items as overviews from a national perspective.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
May I add one more note?
You betcha.
From a history point of view. 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. This was Armistice Day. It celebrated the end of World War I and the signing of the truce. And that's what I remember from my growing up days. And the changing of the date, rather than just simply remembering World War I, to make it Veterans Day, I think it was a very significant step toward recognizing the broader responsibility you speak of.
It was. And you said something in your opening remarks that's not in the script, but I want us to follow up on it, and that was your comment about the fact that coming out of World War II, everyone had sort of been presented with the same circumstances, like the rationing and all the different experiences that the folks back home dealt with, which is not the case in the subsequent conflict. Can you say more about that as to how you experienced that?
The rationing of food, particularly sugar, things, rationing of clothes, shoes, all the rest of it, the entire society was impacted. Plus there was, as a child, one of the big things you did was to buy stamps, to go in a book to buy a bond. It was the absolutely broadly across everyone I knew engaged in it, all as part of paying the cost for the conflict. Unlike this latest one where we borrowed money from the Chinese to pay for it, as opposed to the society buying stamps and bonds.
Dean Hutchings, I think that relates to some comments that you shared with me privately before the panel about how who's fighting the wars, who's enrolling in the military today versus previous generations has changed so much, and has changed, therefore, the perspective on that.
Yeah, it really has. Of course, there's always been sort of the warrior class, those whose family traditions, like mine, drew them into the military. But in the Vietnam era, it was, the Navy at least, everybody enrolled to avoid, for most people, to avoid going to the Army. So at the tender age of 22, I was division officer for 77 men. They were all men back in those days. And these were smart guys. I mean, most of them had been to college. They were there for different reasons, which meant you had the whole society representing, every socioeconomic gradient was represented in the military. Now we've got a different environment. People go into the military for multiple reasons, but those who have other opportunities often choose to escape the military. So we have a kind of a class system that's emerging, which I don't think is healthy. I haven't thought enough about this to know whether the reintroduction of the draft or something like that, some compulsory national service, is a good idea. I frankly haven't devoted a whole lot of time to the thought about it, but I do see the consequences of the system now, where one segment of society allows another segment of society to fight the wars for us. And you can see it in the racial composition of the Army. I mean, it's not any big surprise. So I think we as a country at least ought to ponder this for a while and see what we can do to remedy it.
Yeah.
Bob, I would encourage you to pursue that for a different reason. I think it may be a real problem in front of us, because at the rate if sequester is not changed, it runs a very high risk of breaking the covenant with the all-volunteer force. They were told if you work hard and do well, you can have 20 years and a pension. And as sequester is now laid out, if it's not changed, the odds are very high that the second year we'll be sending people home at 12 to 14 years saying, sorry, we can't afford to keep you. And when you break that covenant, then you're going to have to contemplate the draft, or how do you replace it?
Yeah.
If people no longer believe the government will keep their vow, if you perform, we will do this for you.
John, I'd like for you to take this next question first and then ask Admiral Inman and Dean Hutchings to also respond. You're really focused today on serving those who are returning, today's veterans. You've been faced with some challenging circumstances as a result of that. How do you think we're measuring up as a nation, and what do you think the prospects are for the current generation returning, specifically from Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think as a nation, and I'll get into the weeds as much as you want, but right now I'm thinking large scale. I think as a nation, we really need to plan for the aftermath of people returning home as much as we do going to war. And I don't think we do that. And I think that can be done in terms of obviously the amount of resources that are devoted to serving those who have served, but also the way that we actually develop and deploy our troops in terms of where they're coming from, and leveraging community infrastructures and relationships geographically in deploying folks who will return. But what I will say is that we're trying to do better. I don't think we've done an incredibly great job. I see a lot more collaboration and coordination of effort. There's something that I refer to as the all-in approach, which is that every sector of our country really has a role. Nonprofits have a big role. We're playing it. We're out there in the trenches of communities, as are many others, trying to provide individuals in need and families in need with what they require in order to achieve well-being and pursue their lives. There also is a great role for the academic world, for universities, and like University of Texas, as thought leaders, as data collectors and analyzers to help drive the way that we fill needs. Also as conveners. Many universities around the country, and I point to USC as an absolute leader in this arena, are convening the different sectors of resource together to come up with strategies that capitalize on individual strengths. The government has a major role, they play a major role, but this isn't the government's responsibility entirely, and the government needs to reach out into other sectors more effectively, and I must say that they're doing that. The VA in particular is now embracing community providers like Volunteers of America at a whole new level. They recognize that the infrastructure in the nonprofit sector and the expertise of the nonprofit sector, particularly in areas of housing, employment, legal assistance, family support, is something they need to capitalize on. That's a big improvement. Politicians need to be engaged at every level, because a lot of the things that are possible in the community are difficult because of certain policies. And community by community, you can go around and find districts where changes in policy will actually empower organizations like Volunteers of America to do more than they can right now. Lastly, I would say that the philanthropic sector is stepping up, I think, in a big way, and needs to continue to do that. And one of the ways that can happen is through education, understanding how an investment can make a big difference and where to put resource in the community to impact those that you're targeting. I would say that big business, and I would point to Home Depot as the national leader in this arena in terms of stepping up and providing services and resources to help out. But there also are trades, pro bono legal assistance, pro bono medical and mental health assistance. These are all things that are coming together as a nation to help move the needle. And I think as we proceed, we'll see more and more of this, and by engaging all sectors, have synergy at a new level.
Thank you. Admiral Dean?
Veterans Administration will spend about $7 billion before sequester on mental health. Center for New American Security has a new report just out today that titled Expanding the Net, Building Mental Health Care Capacity for Veterans. Clearly, solidly documented need to do it. Let me suggest looking even more broadly at the impact of this effort. When I was a youngster, we had in the state insane asylums where we put people with mental illness and treated them as though they were prisoners. And then recognized the inhumanity of it. Most of those were closed, and the people were pushed out on the streets, homeless, the rest of it. But what's grabbed my attention? Violence. Tucson, Aurora, Colorado, Washington Navy Yard. You can find a mental illness is the key underneath all. So I wonder if, along with expanding what is so clearly needed for the veterans, can we also learn out of that what to look for and how to perhaps begin to address this larger problem in the society of violence from people who are mentally ill?
Yeah, the challenge that we face with knowing how to properly take care of wounded vets, wounded warriors returning is really a new one. We weren't prepared for this. We hadn't experienced this before. A lot of those wounded warriors would have died in the battlefield in conflicts before now, as was the case even in Vietnam. And those that did return wounded were, nobody wanted to hear about it in this society. The wars between Vietnam and the Second Gulf War did not produce many casualties. The first Gulf War produced on the American side very few, produced plenty on the Iraqi side, and those deaths, those casualties need to be counted as well. But on the American side, it's really these two latest wars, the two of the longest in our nation's history, Afghanistan and Iraq, which has produced the challenge on this scale. And we are only now beginning to understand the magnitude of it. Maybe one lesson that ought to come out of this is war is hell. I mean, I know it's trite to say this, but the kind of casual talk that you hear from some politicians about how we ought to go into Kosovo or Rwanda or Syria, these are complicated foreign policy questions. I know we could debate them separately for hours. It's not the particular decisions that I'm talking about. It's the casualness with which political figures can talk about sending young women and men into harm's way. Well, now we see the enormous cost of war. And I hope that out of the Afghanistan and Iraq experiences, we also understand how hard it is to predict the course of a war once you go in. Both of them took turns that nobody imagined. A few predicted what was going to happen in Iraq, but the course of events took on a life of its own, as Clausewitz told us, in the fog of war. So I'm not a pacifist. There are wars that need to be fought. There are some struggles that need to be waged, but the consequences of war, once you start, are so enormous that we need to think really long and hard and much more seriously as a country before we sort of cavalierly say, let's go into Libya, let's go into Syria, because it's the right thing to do. Well, it may be the right thing to do in some sense, but there's going to be an enormous cost to pay.
And Bob, I am struck by the overwhelming preponderance of those who advocate who never serve themselves.
Right.
Mike, can I just make it? I just want to add on. In addition to the fact that there are service members who are returning after suffering, otherwise life-ending injuries. These recent conflicts, and again, the longest war in our history, are marked by multiple deployments because it's such a small population, and during deployment, exposure to chronic, life-threatening environments. So if you're a neurobiologist or a psychiatrist or someone that's interested in these areas, this is the perfect storm for creating a trauma that's going to have a lasting impact. And as far as mental health issues go, we do have a great need to improve the amount of mental health services that are available to those who require it, and it's not only about getting more services out there, it's about getting them to those who need them when they need them. And it's about getting those who need them access to those services, because many, many folks, and particularly those who have suffered and are in the greatest need, are isolated. And many of them are unaware of what services are available, are incapable of doing it themselves, or when they've tried have been turned back or been told, yeah, sure, you can come and see us in a month or 6 weeks. Well, that's not how you deal with mental health issues.
One population that we haven't talked about yet, but who was going to be here with us and had to cancel due to a back injury at the end of last week, was Major General, Mary Saunders, to bring us that perspective of women in the veteran services arena now, and they represent virtually 15% of today's military, almost 2 million people who are female veterans in the country. What are some of the unique challenges that you're hearing about, John, and the contrasting experiences, Admiral and Dean, regarding women veterans and women veterans in combat? John?
Well, this is a new, relatively new phenomenon in terms of having this number of female veterans, and for them to be experiencing the types of exposures that they have. Obviously, there's combat trauma is combat trauma, but in addition, there are traumas that are occurring that are often referred to as military sexual trauma. I would also add in the trauma of power inequality, where female veterans are suffering at times. There's also the issue of moral injury, which we haven't discussed, which I think has been very prominent in this group. But there, in addition, is the family, and the issue that many female veterans, and somewhere in the order of 40%, are actually leaving behind dependents. These are very, very difficult challenges. And upon return, what we find is that, whether it's the VA or it's the human service sector, or it's just the civilian population, we're not set up for women coming home from war. That's just kind of not a part of our lexicon right now, and it's becoming so, but it has not been. So when a lot of the work that we do at Volunteers of America is dealing with homelessness, for example, but homeless female veterans, particularly when they have dependents, are not in the street. They're not being counted by HUD and identified and put into shelters. They're living in cars. They're couch surfing. And then many of them are putting themselves in compromising situations yet again. So we really need to think about these special issues for female veterans in moving forward. And there are definitely significant efforts in that direction, but we have a long way to go.
We've been accustomed for certainly these post-World War II years of long deployments, particularly Navy. 7 months, 9 months, 13 months for Marines. In virtually all those cases, it was the husband, if there was a family. The wife was left to care for the children, the rest of it. But there were support structures around to help do that. it's been unique for me to watch for Iraq and Afghanistan, the number of cases where the deployed spouse is the mother and wife. And frequently, it's clear the husbands were not prepared to be left behind as the principal child caregiver in that prospect. So they're ongoing problems, and clearly, it's led to a lot of broken marriages at the end of it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I just will say that I think it's pretty clear where we're going is the elimination of all barriers to women serving in combat roles. I mean, it's sort of hard. You try to draw one line, or attempts have been made to draw one line after another. I really don't think there's any way to do that. I mean, there's some cases where maybe a lack of upper body strength might come into play, but then it's a question of the upper body strength, not the gender. So I think all those things are going to fall away. They are falling away very quickly. And I think this process, it's sort of a process of equity, but I think it's outraced where society is. So we do have, as Admiral Inman pointed out, this sort of disjuncture between the rapidity with which the rules have changed in the military and the slower pace of social mores.
I'd like to give the panel sort of one more shot on just the issue of the multiple tours and the new clinical impacts of that. Every person that we've dealt with in the military and every person that we've dealt with returning home, this is really sort of a first-time occurrence of literally having 4 and 5 tours repeatedly there, and then the kind of special challenges that's given our social service infrastructure.
Can you rephrase that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, what's the differences, particularly with the PTSD demands on?
Oh, right.
Multiple.
From
Yeah.
multiple
So
tours?
as I was saying before, I mean, it is a perfect storm. PTSD is actually, in my mind, a very physiologic response. When an individual, an organism is threatened, it's good to be able to respond. That's part of the evolutionary trend. So when faced with a threat, our nervous systems really kind of have several things that it will do. It will remember that event and imprint that event, and then it will essentially launch what we all know as the fight or flight response. Right? So what you see when you actually treat or study post-traumatic stress is individuals will have those memories which are recurrent and many times intrusive. You hear about nightmares. You hear about, in some severe cases, hallucinations of an event reoccurring. And then in terms of the fight, well, you hear about folks being hypervigilant, sometimes paranoid, sometimes irritable, sometimes impulsive. Right? Well, those are things that are programmed into our nervous systems to help protect us. And then on the flight side, isolation, depression, dissociation. These are all very, very normal, important physiologic responses that promote survival. But if your nervous system is being exposed to that type of threat chronically, day after day after day, on repeat occasions, multiple deployments, it really wreaks havoc. In fact, it's the very rare individual that can tolerate those types of settings chronically and return and not be impacted. In a sense, there needs to be a decompression, and we need to have resources available to help lead people through that decompression. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Mike.
Yeah.
And now there are very important developments in the medical industry right now. Cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing treatment, which is a subtype, exposure therapies, which are really designed to help an individual re-experience a trauma and de-energize it, make it less threatening, so that on a day-to-day basis, it's not intruding upon and interfering with their ability to function.
Can I shift from my
You bet.
gloom to one optimistic note
You bet.
in all of this? In my days of going to sea in the 50s, early 60s, you waited for mail call. Might be 6 weeks, and then you'd catch up with a whole batch of letters that would come. That was the only communication. If you went into a foreign port, a long-distance call back was extraordinarily expensive to do. Now, they're in communications every day. And I hear back many positive responses from those who've deployed, and it doesn't help them solve the problems. Sometimes knowing all the problems that are going on at home divert or more of a worry. But it's the reality of the modern social communications vehicles have at least permitted some ongoing closeness that was lost in earlier times.
Yeah, couldn't imagine Skyping during World War II. I mean, those things just wouldn't take place.
No.
Just wouldn't take place. Well, I think we're at the point now where we want to turn the questioning over to you, to the audience, and our comments regarding raising the awareness of these issues and what we can do as a country and individuals and organizations to respond to this. So, Brady, I'm going to turn it over to you guys and pick folks that are raising their hands. Oh, okay.
Brandon over there.
Well, but yeah, but they'll be able to hear you on the streaming. So let's, yeah.
Well, waiting
Yep,
for
go
that
for
one,
it.
this one.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. My name is Brandon Archuleta, Army veteran officer and LBJ graduate student. I have a question for each of you, and I'll hit you in succession. Dean Hutchings, as a veteran yourself and a Naval Academy graduate from the Lesser Service